Good evening and welcome to the new Bugajski Hour from Washington, D.C. I would like to thank Voice of America for hosting the Washington episodes of my show for RTK. And today I will be discussing important international questions with a major security analyst. Our guest on the Bugajski hot seat is Mike Haltzel, Senior Fellow at the Center for Transatlantic Relations, Johns Hopkins University. He's a former advisor to Joe Biden and a key figure in Balkan policy over the past 25 years. But first, my political commentary on a key international topic is entitled Three Paradoxes of U.S. Policy. 9 months into the Trump presidency, three major paradoxes have persisted in U.S. policy towards Europe. Resolving these paradoxes to strengthen the transatlantic bridge is the main challenge for the rest of this decade. The first U.S. paradox concerns the European Union. Trump's position has been that the EU is America's competitor rather than partner. This is largely a result of the economic nationalists who still have influence over the president and who support the breakup of the European Union. In marked contrast, the Atlanticists in the administration understand the importance of the EU to preclude new nationalist conflicts and as America's major trading partner. The second paradox revolves around NATO. When he was a candidate, Trump declared the alliance as obsolete. His position changed dramatically after assuming office. Indeed, the administration has taken steps to strengthen NATO and boost Western security. Two main factors are enabling Trump to reinvigorate the alliance: his warnings about insufficient NATO spending and his strategically astute national security team. Several allied governments have now pledged to increase their spending and raise their military capabilities. Trump's team are bolstering NATO's enhanced forward presence along the eastern flank, substantially increasing US defense spending and working more closely with European allies committed to American goals. The third US paradox is the Russia question. Trump may still avoid directly criticizing Vladimir Putin, but both the administration and Congress have sharpened their policy towards an expansionist adversary. Moscow is increasingly fearful that Trump will not fulfill his campaign promises to pursue closer cooperation. In addition, Congress has overwhelmingly passed a new sanctions bill against Moscow for interfering in the US elections. This stipulates financial repercussions for oligarchs linked with the Kremlin, including freezing their bank accounts, and safeguards that the president cannot cancel sanctions unilaterally. Moreover, with the investigations into potential collaboration between the Trump campaign and Russia's intelligence services intensifying, the president will need to demonstrate that he is not beholden to Putin. Despite initial Kremlin expectations, the Trump White House is not moving towards a new reset. US officials have made it clear that Washington can only negotiate with Russia from a position of strength. And as the scale of Russian penetration of the US political system emerges in FBI investigations, the momentum to hit back against Moscow will intensify. It is time for the Bugajski hot seat with our special guest, Mike Haltzel. Mike is a senior fellow at the Center for Transatlantic Relations at Johns Hopkins University. He's a former advisor to Vice President Joe Biden and has been a key figure in Balkan policy over the past 25 years and is a good friend of Kosovo. Welcome back to the show, Mike.
Thank you, Janusz.
Well, we are a year since the election and 9 months since the, actually 10 months when I talk about since the presidency. Beginning of the Trump presidency, how would you assess the performance in general terms, the performance of this administration on the foreign policy side, foreign security policy?
Well, as your viewers can see, I have an I voted sticker on. I'm a resident of Virginia, and we have an election today for governor, lieutenant governor, attorney general, and House of Delegates. So I voted at 7:15 this morning. It's my duty. I think it's a wonderful thing, and it's not unrelated to the Balkans. We'll get back to that. Mm-hmm. But to answer your question, I don't think the Trump administration has done very well in foreign policy. Right now, President Trump is off on a 5-nation, 11-day trip to Asia. And I heard this morning that he's changing his tune on North Korea, for example. That clearly is the biggest danger to the United States and to world peace. Well, he's modified his rhetoric that was incendiary before, and I would submit counterproductive, and now it's all about getting together and talking. Be thankful for small blessings. With regard to other parts of the world, we'll just have to wait and see. His initial response to NATO was profoundly disturbing to those of us who believe in NATO, and I'm certainly one of them. He refused, as you may remember, to publicly come out in favor of Article 5, the Collective Security Guarantee in the NATO Treaty of April 1949. Finally, kicking and screaming, he did come out for it. But he's basically been forced into a pro-NATO position by Congress. I think our viewers should understand that. We have a separation of powers in this country, 3 co-equal branches, the other one, the second one, or third one being the judiciary. Congress is outspokenly pro-NATO, and the vote on the accession of Montenegro to NATO, which of course had to pass the U.S. Senate. According to our Constitution, the Senate gives advice and consent on treaties, and this is an amendment to the treaty I just mentioned, the April 1949 North Atlantic Treaty. The vote was 97-2. What does that mean? It means that even if Mr. Trump was against NATO accession for Montenegro, as I think he was, he would have had his veto overridden. You have to have a 2/3 vote to override the veto, and it was way over 2/3. This is really important.
And that would be a major loss.
It would have been a humiliating loss. Now, you know, why was he against NATO? I mean, he never came right out and said that he was against Montenegrin membership, but he made it pretty clear that he was. Well, I leave it up to you to figure out, except to say that Russia had been pushing very hard against it. I mean, they almost certainly instigated a violent coup attempt in October of 2016 against Montenegro. Would have included assassinating then Prime Minister Milo Đukanović and taking over the government. It was thwarted at the last minute, and they tried to pressure until the very last minute governments against admitting Montenegro. So that was key, and then that was the lead-in to the strengthening of the sanctions regime against Russia because of their illegal annexation of Crimea and continuing illegal interference with troops in Donetsk and Luhansk in eastern Ukraine. So you could look at the result and say it was successful, except it wasn't really the Trump foreign policy, it was the congressional policy.
Well, isn't there also a disconnect between Trump himself and some of his more nationalist advisors and some members of the national security team, including the Secretary of Defense, the national security advisor, very much pro-NATO? Do you see a divergence there?
Well, I do. I mean, I'm not privy to any inside information about what goes on behind closed doors at the White House or the Pentagon or State Department, but it's absolutely certain that retired four-star General Jim Mattis, the Secretary of Defense, is a pro-NATO man. And it's also clear that Steve Bannon, who, although no longer in the White House as chief advisor, is the gray eminence clearly advising Trump in supposedly several phone calls a week, that he's against it. He's against alliances. He's against the EU. He's against all international things. Yeah, I think there's a real tension. And since, to be charitable about it, President Trump is not noted for a large knowledge base on foreign affairs, this becomes very important. Who's advising him at what different time of day?
So what, presumably what he would go with is something that would register a win for him, regardless of which way it swings.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that I get the impression that President Trump views all politics, whether it's domestic or foreign policy, almost like a high school basketball game. How many wins and how many losses do you have? Content is not important. He clearly didn't know a thing about the content of the substitute health care bill that the Republicans, I mean, a disastrous bill that failed. and I'm not sure he really understands the details of the tax bill that they're ginning up now. So there's no indication to me that he understands. I mean, he didn't understand the whole question of burden sharing within NATO. He had no idea what the budgetary framework was and what contributions. He understood 2%, but that didn't mean much in terms of how he applied it in his argumentation. Sure, it's unnerving.
How is Trump, would you say, particularly in Europe, how is Trump perceived internationally by European leaders?
Terribly. I mean, I've looked at Pew, probably our most sophisticated research organization, the Pew, P-E-W, research on the people and whatever the exact title is. They're excellent. And his numbers are catastrophically low. I mean, in the most important country in Europe, Germany, when they ask whether you trust the president's judgment in foreign affairs, or just his judgment, I can't remember if it was foreign affairs or in general, with President Obama, it was around 80%, 80-something, and with Trump, it's at something like 11. He ranks below Putin and Xi Jinping. Talk about a humiliation. No, I mean, he's not. You know, he retains some popularity in a few places like Poland and Israel, maybe, but that's about it.
So what does this signify for how America is perceived and American policy is perceived?
Well, I would hope, fervently hope, that people around the world would make a distinction between Donald J. Trump and the United States of America. He didn't even get a plurality of the public popular vote last year. As we know, Hillary Clinton got almost 3 million votes more than he did. He won legally. We have an unusual system of the Electoral College. His popularity right now in every public opinion poll in the United States is hovering around 37, 38%, by far the lowest of any American president at this time in his tenure in office. But more importantly, a gigantic percentage strongly disapproves of him. I mean, strongly. So, yes, I'm sure some of this is going to rub off, and certainly the opponents of the United States, the Russians, are making political hay out of this with their propaganda apparatus. I would hope that the people abroad, particularly people who have come to understand the United States as, let's face it, their protector, their guarantor for 7 decades, would be able to understand the difference between one controversial president and the country.
Plus, America, of course, is a democracy. We change governments every 4 years.
Yes, we do.
We vote.
We vote.
And paradoxically, some say that maybe Trump will inspire a whole generation of people to actually get more involved.
Well, I think that's happening, and probably on both sides, but especially on the Democrat side. There have been a lot of feature stories in the last few days about how people who've never been involved in politics before, especially younger people, especially women, especially minorities, have declared themselves candidates for local and state office. Terribly interesting and I think very healthy.
And I think the other part of it is people are learning what exactly the separation of powers means, you know, in practice through this presidency.
Well, we may have more of a lesson in the future. It's no secret that Special Counsel Robert Mueller is investigating ties between the Trump campaign and Russia, whether or not there was collusion. He keeps his cards very close to his vest, but last week, 2 of Trump's foreign policy advisors, including Paul Manafort, who was the chairman of his campaign for 3 or 4 months, they were indicted on several counts, including serious ones against conspiracy against the United States. And a 3rd advisor, who was admittedly a younger man, but nonetheless was at the table several times with Trump, talking about foreign policy, a man named George Papadopoulos, not only had been indicted, but he admitted guilt. He pleaded guilty. So we'll wait and see what happens. But count me as someone who was highly suspicious. The newest revelations show the Secretary of Commerce, who's down to his last $3 billion in net worth, retained, even after he became Secretary of Commerce, retained an interest in a shipping company that had ties with Russian hydrocarbon company, which is owned by Mr. Putin's son-in-law. And they're just so much, and everyone knows that American real estate laws are inexcusably lax in the sense that you don't have to make clear who the real owner of property is. And what does that mean? It's like an attraction of all sorts of dirty cash from around the world, and it's called money laundering. You make dirty cash clean, supposedly. This has been going on in places like Florida and New York and New Jersey for years, and everyone seems to think that one of the countries of origin, one of the main countries of origin for these eventually laundered funds is Russia.
Russia no longer launders ideology, it launders money.
It launders money too, yeah.
Let me go back to the foreign policy side of this administration. What would you say are the biggest foreign policy challenges? You mentioned North Korea at the beginning. What other potential crises do you see ahead during the course of this administration?
You know, it's an interconnected world like never before. Here we have the intersection of technology and politics. It used to be that, you know, you read your history books from the beginning of the 20th century, and there was a crisis every year. Imagine that, every year. Well, now there's a crisis every day, if not more frequently. Everything is interconnected. I mentioned North Korea because I do think this is the most acute and most dangerous. I mean, I listened to experts on Korea, and I mean, once upon a time when I was in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, I actually for a year did have responsibility for that part of the world, so I have some firsthand familiarity. And the fact is, we're dealing with a volatile regime in North Korea, a family dictatorship, highly unpredictable. And we have an American president who is volatile and highly unpredictable and with no experience. And the stakes are very, very high. I cut President Trump a good deal of slack on North Korea because, as he says, he's right. Until now, our policy hasn't worked. But that is number one. And I think that when he goes to China in a few days, my guess is that will outweigh every other consideration that we have with the Chinese. He will make, in my opinion, statements about getting the Chinese to stop their predatory trade and investment policies, but I don't think he's going to push terribly hard. I don't think he's going to talk too much about Taiwan. He wants support on Korea, and that's the priority that he should do. So if he does that, more credit to him. What are other problems? International terrorism. We've seen how a guy with a truck can go on a jogging path in New York City or in Barcelona or London or Nice is the first one, I guess. And people with guns people with knives can stab. I don't want to make light of it. It's a horrible thing. Bombings, terrorism, it's a horrible, horrible thing. But I think we have to keep cool. The terrorists, be they ISIS-inspired or just plain freelancers, are not sufficiently strong to damage our democracy if we remain calm and strong and we remain resilient. In that sense, I have confidence. It's a big challenge. I don't want to minimize it, but I want to put it into perspective. It's nowhere close to the danger of a nuclear exchange with North Korea.
Sure. And more people die in this country from gun violence.
Absolutely. or on the highways, just driving on a weekend. I mean, there are all sorts of things. So we shouldn't panic, is what I'm saying. So those are two crisis points. I'm sure you want to get around to the Balkans at some point.
I'm sort of beginning to zero in on Europe now. Let me ask you about the Balkans in a second. NATO. You mentioned NATO at the outset, that Trump during the campaign called NATO obsolete. It took him a while to recognize, or let's say acknowledge, Article 5 as being the core of this alliance. Yes. But Montenegro did accede to the alliance. NATO has strengthened its enhanced forward presence along the eastern flank with Russia. How do you see this developing? In other words, NATO, let's say NATO planners and our national security team do want to strengthen NATO, particularly along the border with Russia and the Baltic states, Poland, Romania, and so forth. Do you think this will proceed?
I think it will, and as you may know, I just got back last summer from spending a year in Finland,
I was going to ask you, yeah.
as visiting senior fellow at the Finnish Institute of International Affairs, and along with being concerned with the Balkans, I've also been concerned with the Baltic for many decades. I think this, incidentally, in my opinion, was the most outstanding success of President Barack Obama's foreign policy. I argue with some of his foreign policy decisions, but I think the enhanced forward presence, the reassurance measures that he rammed through Congress, over $3 billion worth, and also sold our NATO allies on, is huge.
Yeah.
And I think it will proceed apace. Look, there wouldn't be any need for this if you didn't have belligerent, aggressive behavior by the Russians. And Vladimir Putin feels the need to do this because he, in my opinion, feels illegitimate. His domestic policies are in the tank. Now the price of oil has gone up to about $55 or $56 a barrel, so it's helping him out a little bit. But the fact is, he has no economic plan that can work, and the only way that it could work would be to clean up the corruption and the nepotism around him, and that would, of course, weaken his hold on power. His first, second, and third priority is regime preservation. So if your domestic policies aren't working, as they're manifestly not working, what do? Well, you go off on foreign adventures, and that's precisely what he's done. So, I mean, what possible reason would there be to have incursions into Finnish or Swedish airspace or sea space? I mean, that's nonsensical from any rational person in Russia would say, what the heck are we doing this for?
Will it drive both countries into NATO?
Possibly. It's funny.
It's
almost
neutral,
like the game,
Sweden and Finland.
Sweden and Finland. And I have to say, immodestly, I was one of the first people in the West to draw attention to this years ago. It's almost like the game at American carnivals called whack-a-mole, where you hit a peg down and with a figure on it, and when it goes down, something else goes up, and you hit the one that's up, and the other one pops up. So what I'm trying to say is that public opinion in Sweden and Finland are out of sync with each other. Until recently, I mean, right now, Sweden is much more inclined to abandoning its policy of non-alignment than is Finland to military non-alignment. They're not non-aligned because they're members of the EU, which means they're firmly in the Western camp. Until Trump came in to office, the three most recent public opinion polls in Sweden had shown a plurality, not a majority, but in the high 40s, a plurality for joining NATO. And all of the non-socialist political parties, except the neo-fascist Sweden Democrats, had come out for NATO membership. Now with Trump exercising this negative image on the United States, its support has fallen in Sweden, but if the Russians fool around again with more submarines, I think it'll go back up. Finland's a different situation. Finland has a stronger military than Sweden. They have conscription. They can field a remarkably high number of well-equipped troops very quickly. And they have never demobilized the way Sweden did after 1995. They have an 800 and some mile border with Russia. They have experience with the Russians.
Wars, two major
well,
wars.
Sure. They had the Winter War in 39-40 and the so-called Continuation War from 41 to 45 to 44 when they changed sides and kicked the Germans out of Lapland. The president of Finland, Sauli Niinistö, who's running for re-election, was for NATO membership for Finland when he was just a regular politician with the National Coalition Party. When he became president, he felt that he should be above, I think, I've only met him once or twice, so I can't speak for what is in his head, but and my impression has been that he felt that the president should be above that fray, and so he's taken a non-committal position. When he has met with Putin, and they have regular meetings, much more frequently, I think, than any other foreign head of state, I think twice a year, Niinistö has made quite clear in public statements that Finland reserves the right to join any alliance it wants to, and he's been very forthright. Let me say one thing to your viewers on this point. I've had a good deal of experience with the OSCE. I led several U.S. government delegations to multi-week conferences, including the Vienna Review Conference in 2010, just before the last OSCE summit in Astana, in Kazakhstan, in December of 2010. Why is Astana important? Because at the end of the summit in Astana, the assembled delegates, representing 57 participating states of the OSCE, signed a commemorative declaration. And what did that commemorative declaration say? It said that no country in Europe has the right to carve out an exclusive sphere of influence, and every country in Europe has the right to choose its own method of self-defense, including joining an alliance. This declaration was signed by one Dmitry Medvedev, president of the Russian Federation. I bring that up. So all this talk about how Montenegro shouldn't join, it's aggressive. It's not aggressive. The Russians have signed on the dotted line that this is the right of every sovereign state in the OSCE area. Getting back, though, I made a digression. Right now, public opinion in Finland in favor of joining NATO is in the low 20s. With a very high undecided, high undecided, and if there only one of the candidates running for president, the candidate of the Swedish People's Party in Finland, has come out for NATO membership. The Green Party candidate said that if Sweden would join, then maybe they should join. Most people think that if Sweden would bite the bullet and join the alliance, that things would change very rapidly in Finland in terms of public opinion. But right now, I don't foresee either country joining. In a sense, it's up to Vladimir Putin. I mean, if he wants to provoke, he's going to get two countries joining on his northern flank.
What about in the Balkans? What are the next steps for NATO? You mentioned Montenegro. What about Bosnia? What about Macedonia?
Well, Macedonia would come first. I mean, the international community, the Western world, just simply has to solve this silly name issue. And it really is that. It should have been solved way back in 1995. I won't go through the tortured history of the Greek-Macedonian relations. There's been counterproductive, I would say even childish behavior on both sides. I'm in the strange position. I don't want to be autobiographical, but I'm on extremely good terms both with Greece and with Macedonia. I went to Macedonia with two other Americans to advise them several years ago, long 2-day session. We have to get the name issue solved. It would be in Greece's best interest. It would be in Macedonia's. It would be in the alliance's best interest. The 1995 agreement called for admitting Macedonia to NATO under its name FYROM, the former Yugoslav
interim agreement. The
interim agreement, but that's been blocked, and it shouldn't. There's just no reason to have. Once Macedonia joins NATO, and they will eventually, but it should be soon, not eventually, that would go a long way toward solving some of the domestic issues. It wouldn't solve them all. It's not a panacea, not a magic cure. I think it's quite clear that the leadership, at least, and my guess is the rank and file of the 25% of the population in Macedonia that's ethnically Albanian, very much wants NATO membership. And it's just a question of getting them over the finish line, and that should happen quickly. Bosnia is a little longer term.
What about Kosovo?
Well, I mean, eventually it's possible. I mean, right now, as you well know, we're not talking about membership in NATO. We're talking about membership in the UN. And again, I don't think that this is a zero-sum game, as some people would have it. My friendly advice to Serbia, again, with which I've had great relationships in the past, is get this off the table, solve it, come to some kind of compromise, whether it's Kosovo wants to have its army, have it restructure its army. it's not a massive army. And I think what we could do is just simply say, sure, you can have an army, but it can only be used for peacekeeping missions, whatever else, something like that, to reassure Serbia.
Border patrols.
Or border patrol. I think that it's in Serbia's interest. Serbia wants to join the EU. It can't join the EU if there are outstanding problems with a neighbor. And I think it's you know, I'm a very pro-EU American. I know all about the EU's flaws, everybody does, and it's going through a series of crises from refugees to Greek insolvency to other countries, which have come out of it quite nicely. You know, Ireland is a success story. Yeah. Portugal is doing better. The Baltic states only briefly were in crisis. Greece is doing better. There are crises, let's face it, and now separatism in Catalonia and perhaps elsewhere. But look, the fact is the EU is fundamentally important to the stability and well-being of Europe, of all of Europe. If it weren't there, we'd have to reinvent it. It is capable of reforming itself, and it's the only future for the Balkan countries, the only future.
So what should the United States be doing now vis-a-vis the Balkans? I mean, do you see continuity in from the Obama policy in this administration?
No, not much. I mean, don't forget, I mean, here I'm putting in a plug for my old boss, Joe Biden, but the fact is no other American politician in recent memory knew as much about the Balkans or cared as much about the Balkans as Joe Biden. So he was the point man on all this. And whether it was going to Sarajevo in 2009 to read the riot act to the Bosnian parliament, or going to other countries in the Balkans and giving them what we call tough love, telling it the way it really is, there's no comparable figure that I see in the Trump administration. Moreover, I don't get the feeling that there's the will to be forward-leaning. I mean, you know, what choice do we have? We can sit back and watch things disintegrate. We could sit back and watch the Russians continue their undermining of civil society, of democracy, or we can lead. And there are ways to cooperate with the EU. I mean, the Brits and the Germans had an initiative in Bosnia, which is still on the table. We can try to do that. We can more effectively coordinate and use carrots and sticks. And what do I mean by that? Carrots, everybody knows. You try to channel investment. You try to give foreign assistance in a more rational way. You don't cut back, as the preliminary budget of the Trump administration is doing, not just in the Balkans, but everywhere. What do sticks mean? Well, I mean, sticks mean that people like Milorad Dodik, the head of the Republika Srpska, want to break away from Bosnia and Herzegovina. We make it clear that's not going to work. You just can't do it. And how? There are any number of ways. I've said for years, the European Union should reposition its few hundred remaining peacekeeping troops up in Brčko. They could be reinforced and make it abundantly clear that a Republika Srpska would have to be cut in half and it wouldn't work. Dodik has already been sanctioned as a person by the U.S. government, but the fact is we could say that any attempt at a independence referendum would mean cutting off of all international financial assistance from the international financial institutions. That's just one way. And that would hurt. I mean, the economy's in the tank anyway.
What about with Kosovo and Serbia? Could we use carrots and sticks there? How would you see that?
You know, my sense is that the relationship there is marginally better, perhaps substantially better than the Republika Srpska situation. I think that there are people both in Belgrade and in Pristina who understand that their futures are intertwined, and I have some hope there. You know, I'm going to say something which is again probably going to be unwelcome in some quarters, but I think the intervention by the Albanian, not Kosovo, Albanian foreign ministry in Montenegro over the last week was exactly the wrong kind of behavior. The idea that they should broker some sort of a deal among 4 ethnic Albanian parties in Montenegro over a municipal issue in Tuzi is just, and then brag about how they've done that. I mean, Tirana does not have any special right to anything in Montenegro. And from my standpoint as an American who believes in multi-ethnic, multinational democracy, the best thing that one can say about Montenegro is not its natural beauty, and it's not that it joined NATO. It's that it's the only country in the Western Balkans where both an Albanian ethnic minority of about 6% and a Slavic Muslim minority of about another 13% are completely integrated into the country's life. Why on earth would you want to destroy that or even tamper with it? I think it was just plain dumb, and I would hope that the foreign ministry in Albania would wake up and stop this kind of behavior.
And Serbia and Kosovo, going back to this question, because there's constant question now of this zajednica, this alliance of Serbian municipalities within
and
Kosovo.
I see where they've just exchanged officials today across the...
But there are Serbian members of the new government.
Ibar River, sure. Yeah. Look, it clearly is a... it gives Serbia a certain amount of sanctioned influence in Kosovo. There's no doubt. There's no getting away from that. Maybe that was a price that the Kosovars had to pay. I guess it was. I'm sure that the ultranationalists in Kosovo are upset about that. I don't want to be naive and sound like a choir boy, as we say. I've been to these areas. I've talked to people. I know they can get along. Yeah, there are going to be some troublemakers. There always are. But I know, left to their own devices, as we say, ethnic Serbs and ethnic Albanian Kosovars can get along, and other minorities can get along. I think the difference between Republika Srpska and the ties between Serbia and Kosovo is really the EU, the big carrot there. The fact is, Mr. Vučić says he wants to join the EU. I believe him. Wants Serbia to join the EU. I believe him. There was a big flap because Huityi, one of our leading Balkan experts in the State Department, made a statement a few weeks ago that Serbia is going to have to choose between Europe or Russia, and everybody was bent out of shape. You don't say that. You know, he's right, ultimately. I mean, it's at the end of the day, now, having said that, I'm going to qualify what I just said. It would be a whole lot more believable if the EU would enforce its own rules and regulations against some of its members, and I'm thinking primarily about Viktor Orban in Hungary and the government in Poland. And there's an ongoing process in Poland. You know much more about this than I do. But the EU would have much more credibility in sticking to the accession process, the 30-some chapters that they have to open and close, if in fact they were self-policing countries that are already members. That having been said, at the end of the day, if they don't close their chapters, they're not going to get in.
By the way, you mentioned Hungary and Poland. Some would add Spain now to that list, potentially violating the rule of law over Catalonia.
Yeah, I don't think it's quite in the same league, but it's potentially. Yeah.
Back to Russia,
Sure.
because as you mentioned, the more inactive we are, or the less active the European Union is, nature abhors a vacuum. Russia steps in. Russia actively wants to destabilize this region to prevent it moving into the West. What should we be doing vis-a-vis Russian subversion in the Balkans, and how dangerous is it?
Well, I think it's dangerous, and I think it's subversion. I mean, I don't think Russia has much to offer in a positive way to these countries. both in the short term or the long term. I guess short term they can always drop the price of natural gas so they can, throw out some goodies here or there, and they can always bribe politicians, which they've done elsewhere in Europe. But in a meaningful sense, what do they offer? They certainly don't offer a model of governance unless you believe in personal autocracy that's fueled by corruption. So it's basically an attempt to subvert democracy and civil society. How do you counter that? I mentioned the word resilience before. I think it's all about building societies, not just governments, but societies that are resilient, and it's difficult. I mean, everything ties together with everything else. In this sense, the Balkans might learn from the Nordic-Baltic area. NATO has a cyber defense center in Estonia. Finland has just, which is not a NATO member, as we know, but an EU member, has just opened a center on hybrid warfare. I would hope every country in the Balkans would fund at least one knowledgeable expert to go up to these places and spend a year there and learn what they're doing and learn how to combat fake news, real fake news, not fake because you don't like the sound of it, but made up news and inflammatory stuff. I would hope they would do that. There's another element. I mean, look, the Russians have utilized, sad to say, the Russian Orthodox Church. This is this has been weaponized in a way that if I were a Russian Orthodox believer, I would be scandalized by it. So how do you combat it? You combat it by being vigilant, by working with civil society, not being afraid of it. Just because some NGOs might not be very fond of the current government in power in a given country doesn't mean that they're not patriotic and that they couldn't work together with the government against a greater threat from the outside. And I think you have to start from that. We have a term in American business, as you well know, win-win. This is a win-win. It should be a win-win. It can be a win-win. Don't fall into the trap of zero-sum thinking that the Russians would have you believe.
Another part of it, you mentioned corruption, Russian money. Certainly in the United States now with these Mueller investigations, we are, or he is, tracking how Russian money has infected our systems. Shouldn't we be doing the same thing in places like the Balkans?
Of course. But let's be honest, even without the Russians, there would be corruption in the Balkans. I mean, the corruption in the Balkans predates the Russian meddling. They just exacerbated it and made it much bigger. It's a problem, and I understand that there is maybe not an exactly direct correlation, but a general correlation between economic well-being, economic growth, and lack of corruption. I mentioned Finland, a country I'm quite close to. It's it's perennially number one or number two, or
Estonia or Finland. Yeah.
These are the two least corrupt countries in the world, and well, actually, Finland's just gone through a recession. So I'm gonna modify what I just said, but there it's so deeply ingrained in the culture that it's resilient. It can withstand economic buffeting.
What do you think about how do you see the future of the European Union? You mentioned earlier that it's resilient. That is this just muddling through, or do you see a revival of the European Union?
It's a tough time for the European Union, but it's a tough time for democracy all over the world. Populism is a grab-all term, and there's populism on the left and the right. Whatever it is, there's ethno-nationalism rising. I mean, even in Germany, which has always been the bedrock, the solid core of the EU, the country we can most depend on. The Alternative für Deutschland got almost 13%, and they got the biggest single share of the vote in Saxony, for example. And their leading spokesman is just off the reservation, right-wing neo-fascist. That's scary. There are these kind of movements in all sorts of countries. I mentioned the Sweden Democrats before. They're lineal descendants of pro-Nazis in World War II. It's a rare country that doesn't have right-wing parties. And there are some left wing. I'm not so thrilled with the Greek government from the left side. It's a tough time for the European Union. I think they're going to, you call it muddle through, maybe that's the answer, simply because they have to. Brexit, we haven't mentioned, and that's a huge factor. I mean, it's a gigantic factor, and it seems to be, they seem to be heading toward a non-amicable divorce, which would be the worst thing for everybody. You know British politics much better than I do, but the last few days have seen scandals galore. Taken individually, one sex scandal is not, it's unpleasant, but it shouldn't be all that important. But the drip, 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 and coming at a time when Prime Minister May is having difficulty keeping her conservative government together in order to have a united front to negotiate.
Exactly, no focus with negotiations.
Total lack of focus, and it's too bad. I mean, I think that the British voters made a wrong decision, but we have to live with it. There's some positive things, though. There's been, in the last year, maybe spurred on by Brexit, there's been much closer organic cooperation in security matters between the EU and NATO. I won't go into detail, but it's there, and it's something that I wouldn't have believed possible. The difference is that the EU, for a change, is serious about security. So I think, that's one bright spot. I think the economies, actually, the EU economies are doing better.
Right.
How long this will last, I don't know.
Except the British economy, which seems to be stalling.
Well, I know. That's just a tragedy.
How do American-EU relations fit into this? I mean, during the campaign, Trump did support Brexit. These nationalists around him, as you mentioned at the outset, do not like dealing with an alliance. They want to deal on a bilateral basis with each country. How does that affect the transatlantic relations?
Well, it doesn't help. I mean, I think the Europeans have just already in 1 year, or almost a year, have gotten used to off-the-cuff tweets every morning by the U.S. president and statements by cabinet members that are disavowed within 24 hours by the president or cleaned up by the staff or whatever else. It's not easy to be a ambassador of an EU country in the United States these days. No, they don't help at all. And I mentioned Wilbur Ross before. What I'm about to say is not revealing a state secret because there were a few thousand people there, but last month I was, my wife and I were at the annual reception for the Day of German Unity. A great event hosted by the German ambassador and their palatial grounds there, and it was very upbeat and very positive in every way. And the representative of the U.S. government there was Wilbur Ross, the Secretary of Commerce. He was a very bright guy. I mean, and he's made a lot of money, and he's very smart, very well educated, very well spoken. And in his speech, in his toast or whatever you call it, kind of a speech, at one point he actually said, we would like to conclude a bilateral trade treaty with Germany, but we can't do it because it's in the EU. I mean, I couldn't believe that. This is that. Well, the host, the ambassador, and glossed over it, didn't even mention it, I guess, allude to it in his toast. But that sort of stuff is I mean, I don't know who advised him to say that, or whether you even got any advice, but it's just childish.
It's counterproductive because it's much more efficient to deal with one single trade treaty rather than 30-odd bilateral treaties, which isn't going to happen anyway because they cannot negotiate that way.
Yeah. TTIP is not dead. Actually, it's sort of in a holding pattern, and we'll wait and see. I mean, I never give up until the final whistle blows. Yeah. And I think it's possible. I wouldn't put a percentage figure on it, but it's possible that it will be that negotiations will resume, and in some form, it will be negotiated. It makes a whole lot of sense. A lot is made of our trade relationship our, being the United States, trade relationship with Asia. And it's huge. There's no doubt about it, in dollars or whatever currency you want to use. That's only one part of the story, and it's not even the most important part. The most important part is investment.
Yeah.
And the investment of European Union countries in the United States, and going the other direction, American investment in European Union countries, so dwarfs anything with China that it's not even in the same league.
Exactly.
And it accounts for millions of jobs on both sides of the Atlantic.
Mike, I'm going to have to blow the final whistle.
Well, good. It's been a lot of fun talking. Yeah.
It's been very informative, I'm sure, for our listeners, our viewers as well. Thank you, Mike, and we'll get you back on the show at some point.
Thanks very much.
All the best. Thank you. Unfortunately, we have already come to the end of today's show. I've greatly enjoyed being with you and with my colleagues at RTK and here at VOA. Good night, everyone. Stay healthy, be productive, and remain optimistic. See you all very soon. Mira Pavshim.